This is the SQL Server Service Broker module, and in this video we are going to implement the scenario where the initiator service exists in one instance of the SQL Server database and the target service exists in another database of an different instance of the SQL Server. So both services are in different instances. Two servers are involved, and there is the network in between the servers. So we have to implement the security to make secure the network. So let's see what are the steps required to implement this scenario. So this is the one instance of the SQL Server, and this is SQL Server 2017 instance, and the IP of this instance is this one, and the name of the instance is this. And this is the second SQL Server instance which have the target service database, and the instance name is this one, and this is a different IP. And both instance now exist into the different domains. The domain is different, so we have to implement the security. And security, in the previous steps we have discussed that for service broker there are two levels of the securities. One is the transport security and the dialog securities. When the both instance are in the different domains, so we have to go through the certificate based authentication. So now in our case the domains are also different, so we will implement this scenario by using the certificate based authentications. So how to implement the transport security? What are the steps required to implement the transport security? As we have discussed earlier in the videos, that transport security is from point to point. This is the configuration required for the transport securities are on the instance level. So the instance level configurations are always in the master database. For all the steps to configure the transport securities, we have to define using the master database. And what are the steps required for to implement the transport security? We have to use the master database. In the master database, we will create the master key, because this is a certificate based authentication, and the master key is required to protect the certificates which we will define on the both instances. We need a master key to protect these certificates, and we will create the certificate in the next step. On the both instances we will create the certificates, then we will take the backup of these certificates, and backup after taking the backup of the certificate, we will create the remote certificates. The certificate of one instance, we will copy the certificate and install on the other instance. And after that we will create the endpoints required for the both instance. Endpoints are responsible to accept the incoming and outgoing TCP IP connections. To establish the connection between these two instances, we need the TCP IP connections, and for this TCP IP connections we require the endpoints. And TCP IP connection will listen on a certain ports, and the default port for the endpoint is 4022. And then we will define the login on each instance, and this login we required to connect with these instances. We required a login, and with this login we will give the permission for the connection for connect so that we can connect with each instance. And these are the main steps while configuring the transport securities. And this transport security we will define in the instance level and in the master database. And then we will use the dialog security. Dialog security, we know that this is the uh, end-to-end securities. Dialog security is for a certain dialog, and this dialog is exist in the database, so that all the steps, all the configurations required for the dialog security will be defined in the user database. So what are the steps required to configure the dialog security? We will use the database. So the database on this instance is the initiator database, and this is the target database. We have to follow these steps for both the databases to define the dialog securities. So we have to create the master key in the user database, in the initiator database, and we have to create the master key in the target database. And we know that this master key is required to protect the certificates. And then we will create the certificate in the user database on both instances. And then we will take the backup of these certificates. And after that, we will create the backup of one instance into the other, and we will install this backup of the certificates of one instance into the other instance, like the certificate which is created for the target database. We will take this certificate and we will install this certificate on the initiator database, and vice versa. So after that, we have to create the users for these certificates, specifying the user of the target database, and we have to define this user without login. This user will own the target database certificates which we have created. And then we have to create the remote service binding. Remote service binding is used to authenticate, like this initiating service need to authenticate with this service. We need the remote service bindings, and for this for the authentication we will use the user which we have created here. So now let's move to the SQL Server Management Studio, and there we will follow these steps, and we will implement the securities for our third scenarios, so that initiator service and target service can communicate with each other. This is a SQL Server instance where we will create the initiator service, and this is the master database. We have defined the transport security in the master database because transport security is on the instance level. All the instance level configuration will be stored in the master database. So by using this master database, we will create the master key which we'll use for the certificate, and this is the certificate, init certificate on the node 1. And now we will create the endpoint, and for this endpoint we will use the port number 4022, and it will use the certificate authentication and certificate we already created. So the endpoint init endpoint is created successfully on node 1. Now we will take the backup of the certificate which we will created already. We will take the backup on this path, and the backup of the certificate successful, and here is the certificate on this path. And now this is the second node, and this is the IP address of the second node. I will access through the remote desktop. I will repeat the same steps which I did on the node 1, and this is the node 2 where I will create the target service, and this is the instance name. I will use the master database to configure the transport security. So the master key I'm going to create. This is the certificate named target certificate on the node 2, and this is the endpoint, target endpoint on this node. It will use the certificate authentication. So I will take the backup of this target certificate on this location. And now I have already created the init certificate on the node 1. I will install that certificate on this node 2. And this is the init certificate which I created, and I will install now on this node 2. The syntax is like this one. So now the target certificate which I created on the node 2, I will install this target certificate on node 1. This is the syntax. I will define the path from this path, install the certificate on node 1. So after that, I will create the common login for these certificates, and then I will give the connect permissions to this login so that the login can connect to the other instance, and these steps I will repeat on the other node also, where the target service exists. So this is the second node. I will repeat these same steps. Created the common login, and to give the rights for connection only. And now I have completed the steps for the transfer security. I will create now the user database. The user database name is init trading DB. This is a node 1, and I will alter the database for the trustworthy. These are steps are the same like before we did in the other scenarios, and I will create the all the common object of the service broker on both nodes. This I will create the message types, contracts, queue, and service by using this database. So these steps are successful. And now I will create the route in this inner trading DB on the node 1. This route will identify the target service. I have to specify the target service name, and this is the address where the target service exists. Or this target service exists on this IP address which I am accessing through remote desktop, and I have to mention this target service address here, and I can specify the instance name also of the remote DB. Sorry, remote server. So this the inner DB route I defined, and these steps I have to repeat on the other node also. I have to create the target trading DB on the node 2, and I have to define all the steps which I did for the node 1. Same steps I have to repeat here. I will create the basics service broker objects. So now I will create the route here. This is the target DB route. And here I will define the initiator service, because target DB route will identify where the initiator service exists. So to find the IP address of the initiator service, we can use the IP configuration. And this is the IP address for the initiator service. And this IP address I have to mention on the node 2 to identify the initiator service. So node 2, the target service will identify the initiator service through this route. After that, I have to define the dialog security, and for the dialog security, I have to use this user created database, user defined database. I will create the master key, which is required to protect the certificates, and this I created in the user database. I will create the certificate, inner DB certificate. Then I will take the backup of this certificate on this path, and after creating the backup I can verify that this inner DB certificate exists. Yes, this is here. And I will create a user without login for these certificates, and this user I will use for the remote binding. Now I will go on the target other node, and I will repeat these steps for the target trading DB. The backup I created, and I have to create the user, inner DB users, to access the uh, inner DB certificate. And this is the inner DB certificate I will install here on this node 2. And this inner DB certificate I have already here. I took the backup. This now I will install on the node 2. This inner DB certificate I'm going to install, and the username I also mentioned here, and I will access this user the grant. I will grant the connect permissions, and this is I have to grant the send on service permission to this users also. And these steps I have to repeat on the node 1 also. Here I will install the target certificate. The location of the certificate is here. From this location I will installed, and I will going to give the rights to this target user for the connect, and these are the same steps which I already did on the node 2. Now this is the remote binding. Remote binding I have to create for the target service with this authorized user. Remote binding is used to authenticate on the other nodes. So initiator service will authenticate using the remote binding on the target service. So this is the same way I have to repeat this step on the node 2 also. Now all the things are completed. I'm going to send the message from the initiator service to the target service. This sending message is same way which we did in the previous scenarios. So this is a transmission queue. Transmission queue will tell us what is the status of the message. So the message I'm going to send, it's successful. Now check the transmission queue. Transmission queue have the message, and transmission queue will contain the message until the target server will not reply back that the message is successfully delivered. So after successful delivery, it will remove the message from the transmission queue. So now I'm going to check the order pay target queue on the second node. Yes, message is received on it's in the target queue, and this is the target node. 76 IP is for that second node, and this message is successfully delivered to the target service. And now the transmission queue, after some time, it will be clear. So if I am going to check this transmission queue again, it should be clear because the message successfully delivered, and so the transmission queue will be empty now. So this is the way to communicate between the initiator and target service when both services are in different instance of the SQL server.